I am Jingsi Christina Wu, a PhD and Associate Professor of Media Studies in the Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. Welcome to this event, virtual event, titled Fake News and the COVID-19 Pandemic. It's hosted by Hofstra University, and joining me are my distinguished colleagues, both media studies Dr. Sue Drucker, and in journalism, also from my home department, Professor Russell Chun. So the structure of today's event is that the three of us will each try to talk for less than 10 minutes about our respective areas of expertise. And in the meantime, everybody is encouraged to post your questions in the chat area. Everybody's on mute so that, one of those Zoom courtesies, we're not disrupting each other's speech. This event is being recorded, and our hosts will make the link to the recording available shortly. And those of you who have RSVP'd or maybe stepped away during the event could revisit some of the details later after the event. Also, to give you a little background about my expertise and research, as somebody who originally came from China, a lot of my research lies in the cross-section between Chinese media and American media. In the Chinese context, I've published a book on the cross-section between entertainment and politics, given that in China, this very heavily censored speech and political system really makes it hard to talk about politics. And as you may have already heard, with this COVID-19 pandemic, any sensitive subject is also subject to very strict censorship measures in China as well. So naturally, a lot of my research has migrated into areas about politics and media, news media included. And similarly, I've done research about those areas in the American context as well. So I've done some cross-national comparisons, international communication research. Most recently, I published a chapter in the book that is edited by Dr. Drucker and Professor Chun, titled Fake News. So my 10-minute spiel today will be very much focused on that particular chapter, even though in this chapter, much of my research is focused on the 2016 scandal involving expired vaccines in China. At the outset of this pandemic in 2020, I was actually jokingly saying to my editors that maybe I should write a sequel to this chapter, Fake News or Unwanted News, because I just observed so much parallel, so much similarity between how China has repeatedly handled such public scandals, especially public health scandals and controversies, and this latest very unfortunate outbreak of COVID-19. So I will try to keep a timer on myself and try to stop at the 10-minute mark. If any question occurs to you during the process of us three talking, please feel free to write up your question as succinctly as possible, because the three of us are trying to moderate each other as well. And we'll try to go through our questions after the three of us finish speaking. So in that chapter, I discussed at length this general pattern in the Chinese government's approach to its handling of public health related scandals. And some of you who are attending today's event might have already observed similar patterns. So to relate it to the COVID-19 pandemic, the same pattern occurred to the dot. So initially, some local hospitals and doctors discovered this new phenomena, symptoms that are similar. So as you can see on the screen here to the right side screen capture, of this really coded message that doctors, local doctors in Wuhan, were sending each other through WeChat. But even to a Chinese speaker, a Chinese language reader, they could not easily decipher this message, because that's exactly the intention here. Otherwise, the government would immediately crack down and delete this message from any type of social media platform. So doctors initially having discovered these symptoms and alerting each other, communicating with each other about ways in which they could, on the one hand, deal with this issue in a timely fashion. On the other hand, alert the public and do something, especially from a public health management perspective, to stop the spread of the disease in time. But instead, the government's initial reaction was very much just hush, hush, cover up, nothing's happening, everything's great and wonderful. So there was this major period of silence where if anybody were to say something, there's immediate consequence. Police, disciplining, institutional disciplining, even mild voices of opposition or suspicion would be cracked down on immediately. So in my chapter, I discussed this almost vicious cycle that when the citizens of China are, familiar with this pattern of governmental inaction and cover-up, they would now resort to alternative sources of information, at the same time dismissing governmental information as propaganda, as fake news. So in the process of doing that, they now become more vulnerable and more susceptible to actual misinformation, to fake news. So there's this vicious cycle until the government decided, okay, things are getting out of hand. What do we do now? So in January, all kinds of drastic measures were taken. Cities were locked down, borders were erected, people could not leave their apartments, not to mention their cities. No traffic was happening. And to the government's credit, that is how they took care of the initial outbreak and immediately put under control, like within a matter of 2 months, 3 months. Now China can proudly say that we have eradicated this virus. Yes, there's sporadic flare-ups. There are some, local cases, but right now, most of the local cases were actually introduced from abroad, from people traveling back home internationally. So there was this actual sweet spot where speech was momentarily freed up. And personally, I've observed in January and February, it was pretty impressive and eye-opening to see how people were actually able to criticize the government and say certain quite provocative things and mourn and criticize, again, share their grief. But once that sweet spot was passed, once the virus has been put under control, again, this cycle is repeating itself. So on the bottom left corner, I have a screen grab of a ProPublica research report, along with many other similar reports that are coming out of the Western press. So this is definitely not unknown to the Western publics. Personally, I think people are pretty inundated and duly overwhelmed with the seemingly uncontrollable pandemic that is happening on our own soil right now, that we're not paying full attention to this kind of propaganda that is happening from China, disinformation campaigns, misinformation campaigns. And to be perfectly analytical here, I think the Western politic and the Western news press are doing some of this ourselves. So from the federal government to corners and patches on the internet, on social media, people are circulating misinformation and rather offensive narratives and rhetorics about how this is a chemical weapon. There's no outbreak in China. This is a Chinese virus that the Chinese government invented to destroy Western democracies. Granted, these are very minority-oriented, unrepresentative narratives that are not in the mainstream, and more than 2/3 of Americans are taking this very seriously, are doing their due diligence of fighting this virus according to reports and surveys. But when the president of the nation is magnifying these voices, it is inviting even more fierce retaliatory measures taken by the Chinese government. So in the interest of time, I will try to stop here, but I will just summarize quickly that as America continues to fight this pandemic, I am observing that China is definitely amping up its own, again, propaganda wars and misinformation, disinformation tools to both boost this nationalistic sentiment within the Chinese borders. If we have time, I can share some of my observations and findings based on my direct interactions and exchanges with people back in China. But on the other hand, is fighting this dual war by also amplifying these voices in the West about how the virus did not start in China. Maybe it was invented in a lab in America and brought to Wuhan and dropped on the Chinese soil. So now America is reaping its own fruit that it planted. So on that note, I will stop talking and pass the mic to my colleague, Dr. Drucker, who will speak about her research and her specific chapter in this book on fake news and definitions as well.
Well, thank you, Christina, and I am going to try to share my screen as well. And let's see. There we go. Actually, let me take off from where my colleague left off. In terms of what brings me to this topic, I'm a professor of journalism and media studies, and in that position, I do a lot of research focusing on the nature of a medium itself, the importance of the medium. So part of what my evaluation of fake news deals with is the nature of the medium and its role in terms of the developments and changes in journalism in particular. The other work that I do and that appears in the book on fake news deals with regulation. I see the world through law-colored glasses. And so my comments this morning will reference that, but perhaps we can talk more about some of those regulatory issues when we have time for discussion and questions. So that's kind of the perspective that I bring to this topic. And really what I want to try to do this morning is look at the issues from kind of a broader perspective, look at the issues of fake news. What is it and what does it mean? How is it playing out in this pandemic and trying to deal with scientific information about COVID-19? I started out with really the idea that, in the good old days, we may not have had fake news, but we had misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and selective information and lies. And I find myself wondering, is there something really unique about fake news? Because, as I said, after all, fake news predated the digital media environment. So is there anything new today? What is important about talking about fake news today? And what really brings me to my comments today is that I think that there are two very important differences in terms of dealing with fake news today. One is the fact that during the pandemic, during trying to deal with the corona pandemic, fake news is putting lives at risk. The second major variable to look at is the nature of the medium. The fact that the medium used to transmit false information, misinformation, disinformation, etc. It's a different media environment. There are different media used than when we were talking about those old days of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. It's not only the virus that we're dealing with. And in fact, clearly we're dealing with what is being called false information or unreliable information about the virus, that in itself has become viral. And we're now dealing with this kind of new word that's been introduced to describe this, the idea of a disinfodemic environment. And there are headlines about how we're dealing with disinfodemia and the other being labeled the other pandemic. And I think the issue about disinfodemic really gets at the heart of what people are looking for when they buy into false information or fake news. I think that uncertainty, dealing with the unknown, provides really fertile ground for fabrications and for misinformation to go viral and to take hold. To the extent that certainly organizations like UNESCO have recognized that this environment that really is breeding this other type of epidemic of fake news needs to be dealt with. So they've actually, by this point, issued 2 policy briefs where they're trying to give information about fabricated truths, about how to deal with and recognize bogus blogs and websites and altered video images. They are dealing with the idea of conspiracy theories. And by the way, just as an aside, the derivation of the word conspiracy, the Latin root, conspirare, is to breathe together, which seems to me really kind of a perfect metaphor for a respiratory virus. Be that as it may, I just needed to occupy myself during this lockdown period. Conspiracy theories can emerge when, and fake news in particular can take hold, when we feel overwhelmed, when things are complex, when we need to make things more manageable, when we want things to be more simplistic and understandable, and when we want to blame somebody. And the ability to blame somebody, to have an identifiable enemy, provides cognitive comfort. So there are all sorts of motives that we can identify for disinformation and misinformation and fake news, but I wouldn't underestimate the importance of this time period being one in which people feel so out of whack. They feel the ground has shifted beneath them, that they need that kind of cognitive comfort that sometimes fake news a la conspiracy theories can provide. We can look at all sorts of sources and reasons for conspiracy theories and disinformation, everything from obvious things like, political motivation, self-promotion, business purposes. Not all fake news is malicious. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's unintentional. But we've seen a whole range of stories and issues that are raised in terms of the pandemic and fake news. And I just want to unpack some of those, because we've seen stories ranging from false information about the origin of the virus, whether it was a bioweapons program gone wrong, whether it was one version was, obviously one version is that it's created in China, one America. One version was that and this one I think spread in Italy, an American veteran was paid to spread the virus throughout Europe. And another one that was promoted online that got some traction was the idea that French researchers in a laboratory created it because they had patented a vaccine and it would be worth a fortune. So you've got the origin stories, you've got the stories about how to deal with it, like this slide suggests. Drink more water and you can flush out the infection. I won't go into the story of Clorox. I think you've all heard that. We've heard that one of my favorite, by the way, origin stories was that it was going to be a way to solve overpopulation of the elderly. That one was shared by someone who came to work in my house. They haven't been back. You've got COVID deniers that say that there is already, either it never existed or there is already a vaccine, there are already treatments. And this brings me back to the nature of the medium, because some of these COVID deniers are actually taking to the technologies that are available and making videos and distributing videos via social media to show that, for example, hospitals are not as full as they say they are, and therefore this is all a hoax, that how bad things are is really a hoax. The bottom line for me is that the common thread is the space not only for the dissemination of the virus, but the viral information. In a prior media environment, there was gatekeeping, there were editors, there were barriers to the dissemination of information. The current media environment, we don't have as many gatekeepers. We have cheap access to accessible channels for the dissemination of information. And I think that the relationship between the global pandemic and the global media environment, particularly the social media environment, really can't be minimized. Now, I think what we're dealing with are different variations on a theme of false information. And I think that I'll just take a moment to deal with these, because I think that there's value when we're trying to fight back, when we're trying to analyze false information and fake news, understanding the kind of variations on a theme of this kind of false information can actually be a useful tool. So for example, part of what we're dealing with is disinformation, and disinformation is really rooted in the idea of trying to intentionally obscure the truth. It's disguised. That can be contrasted with misinformation, and also often these are conflated, but they're distinct concepts, because misinformation doesn't necessarily have any kind of a nefarious motive to it. It could be unintended, but it's mistaken or false information. We're also dealing with fake news that are lies, a false statement, deliberate intent. Sometimes it's an unintentional falsehood, but it creates a false impression. My colleague and I, Gary Gumpert, who co-authored one of the chapters in the fake news book that we've been talking about, focus on the idea of the big lie, Hitler's big lie dealt with in Mein Kampf, and the idea that a lie that is so bold and restated to function to conceal the truth can take on great import. It's a very important technique that didn't die with the Nazis, although the Nazis, unfortunately, haven't died either. But the idea of repetition, redistribution, it takes on a power, a life of its own. And I think in a social media environment, we're seeing a good deal of that. There's also propaganda, and Christina mentioned the concept of propaganda. And again, propaganda is in this mix. It's a form of misinformation, and intentionality, again, is key. Propaganda has to do with political motivation. It could be organizational motivation. It could be commercial motivation. I think we often just categorize it as political, but I think that it's more than that. I think that the long history of propaganda, of misinformation, of disinformation, of lies, suggests the importance of something being camouflaged. Right now, we live in a media environment where some of us are even immune to the idea that all sorts of things are camouflaged. Sponsored content is camouflaged. Unvetted news or press releases are entering into our news cycle. If you've ever gone to a website, a credible website, maybe you think CNN's a credible website, New York Times, credible website, and sometimes embedded in that, you'll see a small statement that says this is sponsored, right? Well, that's part of the kind of disguised media environment in which we live. When we look at things in terms of the media environment, the power of the medium itself used for distribution, I want to point out just a couple of last things. Fake news, I think, can be best understood by examining the medium of transmission to disseminate the information that's false. Now, what's new about this phenomenon? Well, we live in a digital era. We live in an era of the internet and social media. So that's the key to understanding this phenomenon to me. There are essential underlying characteristics of digitalization of the internet. Its speed, velocity, multiplicity of sources, the limitations on distribution, the costs associated with distribution have virtually been obliterated. So we have a proliferation of channels. We have a multiplicity of sources, and everything looks very authentic, right? We have the tools available to us, very inexpensively available to us, to make something look really professional, to make it look as if it really does come from a credible source, like UNESCO, for example, or the World Health Organization, or we're repeating a story that was put out on BBC. It looks authentic, but it may not be. And so part of what we do as good media consumers, to be active and to be media literate, we're told cross-check. So you go to multiple sources. Well, you find multiple sources of this authentic looking content across multiple platforms and different places. So sometimes cross-checking will end up leading to the same fake information. Misinformation that's misleading can take the form of things like memes and charts and photos and tweets and posts and articles, and they can all look very authentic. All that, I think, needs to be understood as part of the media environment. The fact that we live in an attention economy as a key to a media environment should also not be overlooked. I mean, think about what is the source of our news. It's no longer just television. Television's getting, and traditional legacy media environments are getting stories from social media. So there's kind of the cesspool of cross-fertilization going on that we need to understand and unpack. The bottom line to me is that digitalization of content and the social media that we're dealing with here, when we're talking about the disinformation and the disinfodemic, is that I think that the responsibility of the receiver has been elevated. That with gatekeeping diminished, the individual assumes a greater responsibility for choosing trustworthy sites. I think the burden has been shifted so that the receiver has a greater obligation to track down sources and cross-check sources that are credible in this very confusing viral media environment. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. We already have one audience member who asked if these slides will be made available later, and if Dr. Drucker agrees, we could, make arrangement for these slides to be distributed, because that document was rich with information and research. And before I hand it to my colleague, Professor Chun. I just want to quickly remind people, please feel free to type your questions in the chat area. It just so happened that this morning I actually listened to an interview with a journalist who wrote a book in 2017 titled Fantasyland: How America Went Haywire. And this book was written 3 years prior to the 2020 pandemic. But the notes that Dr. Drucker made in her really illuminating talk a moment ago struck some of these critical key points that the journalist made in his book. We can talk about it in a later moment, but essentially he argued that America was essentially built on this ultra individualism foundation. America has always been anti-elitist, anti-authority. So on the good side, it's a virtue, it's a merit of our democracy. But as Dr. Drucker noted, when we're faced with a pandemic, there's life consequences, there's real human lives on the line. And her conclusion really struck me in the sense that maybe in the new media age, media literacy now has become our civic responsibility. Before we act on a piece of information, before we hit share on our social media platforms, maybe we should all do some due diligence of fact checking and cross-platform checking before we share it forward. So before I go too far down the rabbit hole, I will introduce my other colleague, the third and final speaker, Professor Chun, to share some of his own research as well.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. I have a couple of notes that I want to share. So let me see. So I'm going to piggyback off of what Dr. Drucker was talking about. And what I want to talk about today is maybe highlight a couple of specific examples of fake news and see how that can fit into this framework of fake news and misinformation and disinformation. And I want to say something about what Christina, what Dr. Wu said was, we have to be responsible for what we share. And what I'll demonstrate in my talk, hopefully, is that, we may be accidentally sharing some misinformation, but we don't know where that message will be. And there's a framework where we have to consider the agent, the message, and the interpreter. And the interpreter can become the agent. And the intent can change. And I'll show you that how misinformation can become disinformation. And so we have to be wary about that we are being used. So let me start off by sharing this quote. We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. And this is the WHO Director General said this back in February at the Munich Security Conference. And I like this because Dr. Drucker was talking about, there's this twin pandemics, this twin threat. And I think it's nice that it's being recognized here. So, fake news on COVID runs a spectrum, all right? It runs a gamut from misconceptions all the way to sort of wacky conspiracy theories. And we can think about it in terms of the misinformation and disinformation. And the key here is we have to think about the intent. Is there a deliberate intent to do harm? And that's really one of the key distinctions. Misinformation is really accidental sharing, all right, of fake information. Disinformation has sort of a devious intention. And so if we look at the causes, cures, and impacts, I'm just gonna look at these three, all right? That COVID-19 patients should not take ibuprofen. That came out of the French health ministry early on. COVID-19 is no worse than flu. Well, that's been promoted from a lot of different people. One of the big proponents was this researcher out of Stanford. Hydroxychloroquine cures COVID-19. Laura Ingraham and Trump called it, a game changer. This was started apparently from a French doctor, Dr. Mehmet Oz picked it up, promoted it on his show. Fox News promoted it, Trump promoted it. What's confusing about this is there was a study in the Lancet, which is a very prestigious medical journal, that put the kibosh on it. But then they had to retract that study. So it's very confusing for the public. And that retraction gave more fuel to the idea that, hey, well, maybe hydroxychloroquine is a valid treatment. So, are these stories fake news? Well, I would argue that, these are kind of on the area where these are legitimate science-based controversies based on different interpretations of data, early anecdotal conjectures. And we have to recognize that, we're in an environment where the information keeps changing, not much is known about it, and science is an iterative, self-correcting process. And so somebody might just jump on something, call it fake news, or and there might be a misunderstanding of the process, the scientific process. So I'm not sure if I would be comfortable labeling those three as misinformation or fake news. Maybe it's premature information that's not fully vetted. So, I think we should keep that in mind. Now, what are some of the more wacky conspiracy ideas, right? COVID-19 was engineered and released by a lab in China, Wuhan. And I think both Dr. Drucker and Dr. Wu referred to this theory. Unfortunately, about 30% of the American public believe this. So this is a statistics out of the Pew Research Center. So, this has impact. This is huge. And it's not promoted by fringe elements or minority views or some large kid in somebody's basement, right? This, one of the biggest, not one of the biggest, but I'll give you an example, is a senator, Tom Cotton out of Arkansas, said this publicly. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. He appeared in Fox News. He wrote on his Twitter feed. He said, the evidence is circumstantial, to be sure, but it all points toward the Wuhan labs. Thanks to the Chinese cover-up, we may never have direct conclusive evidence, but Americans justifiably can use common sense. And he says this again in the tweet. You can see that there. He says, I'm using my common sense, not Chinese communist lies, not the models, not so-called public health experts. So it goes to what I think Dr. Wu was also saying, is that, Americans have this anti-authority, unfortunately, it bleeds into anti-intellectualism. There is this fear of the media elite, are you a so-called public health expert? And it's unfortunate that this is coming from an elected official. So let's look at another misconception or another fake news. The 5G networks caused COVID-19. And 5G networks, the cell networks, have been blamed for a lot of different things. And in this one example, this YouTuber, he's been seen almost 4 million times since last year. And he talks about, the dangers and kind of spins this conspiracy theory. What's interesting, my area of research is visual communication, is the symbolism of the hat, all right? And so it's not a mistake that he's wearing this Make America Great Again hat. And it's really to demonstrate his loyalty. And I think we should really recognize that the powerful tribal loyalties that we have, and how that really affects our ways to digest information. So the hat, it makes his message have greater affinity. And what happened was, this was amplified by celebrities, but it also was pushed by RT America. RT was Russia Today. It's a propaganda machine. This isn't what I'm saying. This is the Senate Intelligence Committee has deemed this to be an arm of the Russian government. And so we think about this, maybe this YouTuber is the agent. He has this message. It goes out to the public, but then it gets picked up by Russia, and misinformation becomes disinformation, because we know that Russia is using social media, is using all different channels to sow discord. And that's their objective, is to create confusion. It doesn't matter if it's on the right or the left. They just want to create confusion. They want to create a lot of noise and distrust toward our institutions. So I think that's what we should really keep in mind about that. I'm going to jump down to some of the issues that I'm just going to highlight, and I talked about. Not much known is about the virus, and Dr. Drucker had said this, so people are more apt to latch on to explanations. And we latch on to explanations that conform to our own tribal beliefs. So, if you are a Trump supporter, you're more likely to subscribe to those pieces. That political dimension of fake news has always been there, and it runs deep. Just recently was last week that some new studies, academic studies came out that said Fox News viewers, particularly not the news segment, but the opinion segment, although, there's a bit of a gray area there, that it's been linked to higher COVID infections. So we can share those studies later on. And then finally, what I mentioned was Russia is amplifying fake news to sow discord, division, confusion. This is interesting. This is from the Washington Post. Russia stopped making up lies because there's already fertile soil. And that's a word that Dr. Drucker said. There's already fertile soil for that here, created domestically. And so they've pivoted from selling fiction to selling spin. And this tactic meant amplifying lies America was already telling itself. So I think it's dangerous in that mechanism when misinformation becomes disinformation. So I'll just leave it at that, and hopefully we have more time for a nice discussion and to answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. The chat area really blew up in the 10 minutes that Professor Chun was speaking. So I've combined some of the questions into just big clusters of discussion threads, given that we only have 15 minutes left and there are some really big questions in the chat area. So we're really humbled by the amount of interest and by the amount of intellectual engagement that all of you attendees, our enthusiastic attendees have shared with us. So hopefully we can keep this conversation going as we move forward. If you have any interest, please feel free to check out the book, Fake News, even though it was published shortly before the pandemic. I would personally vouch that all of the chapters touch on these really recurring and foundational issues that would help us make sense of these ongoing developments. And something that Professor Chun said in his section about how science is an iterative and self-correcting process. So science as a discipline, as a profession, is messier and not as neat and as commonsensical. So that actually relates to the first big question. So if Dr. Drucker or Professor Chun wants to pick up the first question, please feel free to. As an everyday news consumer, given that our attention is constantly being stretched in all directions, especially on social media, on the internet, we want a simple answer. We want the certainty. We want to know what we can do specifically to counter fake news, to tell, like at first look, this is fake, that is correct. So how do we, what should we do concretely to protect ourselves more effectively from fake news? How do we cross-check sources?
I guess for what I would say is, the source is very important. And so should we always, if we're seeing a piece of information that we want to cross-check, we need to really get to the source. And that's just common journalistic practice. And I think it needs to have context, which is also important because many times tweets or videos appear out of nowhere and there's no context to it. So, unfortunately, I think those two things require some brain power. And in our book, one of the chapters talks about our slow thinking versus fast thinking, and we are much more apt to just fire off something. We're going to believe something because it's fast thinking, but we really need to slow ourselves down. I don't know if that's possible in this information environment.
I would just to piggyback on that, I think that there are basic precepts of media literacy that that come into play here. And as Russell just mentioned, what is the source? Does the things like, does the headline match the story? Are quotes verifiable? There are all sorts of techniques in the canons of media literacy to look at. But the other thing, particularly in terms of the current time that we're living through, there are all sorts of resources that have very quickly developed to try to grapple with the coronavirus misinformation, disinformation. So for example, the Poynter Institute has some very valuable information that's available, kind of a user's guide to fake news and to fact checking. It's a very interesting conference, virtual conference held last week that I attended on it was a global fact checkers organization, and they are promoting the development of materials that would be available during this time period. So and I have some of those resources that are available on the slides that will be available for anybody that wants them. So I mean, there are additional organizational resources that are forming. There are NGOs like that are coming together, like Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders are coming together with other organizations to form a working group that's just meeting for the first time this week to create resources and recommendations for governmental and non-governmental organizations to work together to provide the resources that citizens would need. So in addition to kind of the basic guidelines of media literacy, there are an increasing number of external resources that are being packaged to provide help for people online.
And at the same time, I really think that it's imperative as citizens of a democracy to really boost the signal and tell each other that we should not take everything at face value. We should not easily subscribe to these theories, but just a way to easily explain away a controversy phenomena. Here I've shared a very simple example of how, as Professor Chun mentioned, the case of Russia. In this pandemic, research is suggesting that China is actually adopting a very similar strategy that Russia used in 2016 during our presidential elections by hacking to these everyday people's Twitter handles and hijacking their tweets and producing lookalike Twitter accounts. For example, on the left hand of the screen here, you see the official Twitter account of RFA, Radio Free Asia. On the other hand, on the right hand, you see the Chinese, fake account. So definitely there's a lot of a lot more challenge than before, than prior to the social media, to the internet age. Something that I always preach to my students in the classroom is that this is not the time to be cynical. This is not the time to tune out and say, news media are losing their mind. Let's just go with our guts. Let's just, walk on the street and see if people are getting sick. If my neighbors are not getting sick, then the virus is not real. Let's consume more news. Let's take in more different. I understand that sometimes there's the mental health complications. If at all hours, all we consume is bad news about people dying, about people contracting the virus, I think the power really comes from knowledge, really comes from more information. And sometimes it involves crossing the aisle and tuning into what our opponents are saying and educating ourselves about different approaches. So the second question, I think, is more directed at our legal expert here, Dr. Drucker. What are some of the criminal laws that are designed to curtail deliberate false information?
It's a great question. And I can tell you that there are very few in terms. Let's separate out what legal system we're dealing with. The in terms of criminal laws outside the United States, I don't know that this is the direction that we necessarily want to go. There are criminal laws in China. There are dissemination, the intentional dissemination of rumors has been criminalized in China. They've actually even set up an app where people can report potential fakery that the government can investigate that would lead to criminal sanctions. There are criminal laws, and this is dealt with in one of the chapters in the book in Myanmar. Some of you may have been reading about how 9 areas in that country were shut down for political reasons, shut down from the internet access. And so there are people that don't know about the pandemic. But Myanmar has criminal codes about this. United Arab Emirates, and there are a number of other countries that have either created new laws or in most cases extended pre-existing laws to include what they define as fake news, which is kind of a slippery slope in terms of their definitions. What's interesting though, in terms of Western democracies and certainly in the United States, this is not really being dealt with fundamentally from a criminal law perspective. The closest you could get would be kind of fraud, that to the extent that there would be some liability for fraud, but typically this is dealt with more civilly. And from a civil law point of view, there isn't anything that really targets fake news per se. There are some situations where intellectual property, typically copyright in particular, is brought into play to try to bring some liability. So if photos are misappropriated and used in the creation of, let's say, a fake news meme, that's or in a deep fake. I know there are a few questions about deep fakes that are fascinating. So sometimes it comes down to liability for copyright, other intellectual property issues. Sometimes it comes down to defamation or invasion of privacy, which is a tort for the disclosure of false information or false light, invasion of privacy. But there isn't a lot out there. Probably the strongest civil action would be defamation. The false information harmful to reputation. So it's a very narrow definition of what would create liability. But again, it's civil liability. And I would remind everybody that in the United States, false information is still protected by the Constitution. So in terms of what kinds of perhaps large scale or even draconian measures that the government could take, they're limited by the fact that false information is protected by the First Amendment. It's protected information. So a long way of getting at the fact that from a legal point of view, there are lots of people looking at how to deal with this, but I don't think that there is any one clear pattern yet. It's a fascinating area. In the United States, in France, in Israel, the approach that they've taken is to limit attempting to regulate fake news, focusing on fake news about elections. And so that's been passed in France, that's been passed in Israel, it's been proposed as the Honest Ads Act in the United States. Senator Klobuchar proposed it with Senator Warner in 2017, nothing happened to it yet, but that seems to be the approach taken, much more than criminal approach.
You know, I want to,
go ahead.
Sorry. So there was a question about deep fakes, and that came up too. I don't know what the actual question is, but I would say that in general, you know, we found that fake news doesn't really need to rely on sophisticated technology like deep fakes. It can be really crudely made. It can be quickly generated. And, you know, it used to be that you needed to be like a Photoshop master. There's a lot of tools online to do that, but you know, even something really obvious can go viral, because I think we're primed to share those sort of things, which is unfortunate. So it doesn't need to be super slick. And it also goes to, I think, what, you know, our visual, our need for visuals. And this is maybe something different, but what I find particularly unique about COVID, fake news about COVID, is that there are very few visuals as evidence. And a visual communication scholar, Paul Messari, he talks about attributes of visuals. And I talk about this in the book. One of them is this idea of indexicality, that visuals serve as authentication. And so for a COVID pandemic, when you don't see, you know, people getting sick, I mean, we do have reports of, you know, bodies, but it's a lot harder than, say, a natural disaster, where you're seeing massive people losing their homes and this sort of thing. And so I think that helps breed people's suspicion that, wait a second, I don't really see people dying left and right. You know, how can it be that bad? Anyway, so that's what I'll say about that.
And the questions and comments are really coming at us fast and furiously. Some are really great resources. Our former colleague, Dr. Nancy Kaplan, actually shared a link to another news literacy project. Some people are very interested in sharing the resources and the conversation from today. So please feel free to, you know, the more, the better. We're all trying our best. Sometimes, you know, scholars are not really the best ambassadors of these. Like, we can really go on all kinds of venues to preach to the public. But as one of our colleagues, Dr. Rodney Hill, mentioned, on the day-to-day basis, on the ground, when we're talking to our family and friends, especially those people who did not attend college or did not, you know, were not previously exposed to all of these vocabularies, the kind of language. How do we talk to them without necessarily coming off as talking down? You know, as you know, all the way back, we're talking about this knee-jerk reaction to this kind of elitist approach to fake news. Somehow, if the moment I say fake news, you're already not on the same caliber as me. You know, on a day-to-day basis, you know, even myself personally, I have to adjust my strategies when it comes to my own family and friends who are very educated, some of whom have PhDs, you know, who, you know, operate with a very different set of information. And how do I have a conversation with them without just cutting off and saying, okay, you're reading the wrong newspapers or you're watching the wrong news channels, therefore end of conversation. And to me, I think it's becoming all part of that package of our civic skills and civic responsibilities to be able to have these conversations calmly, respectfully, and with an informed background. So sometimes the number one thing I would say to my family is, if you want to bring some information into our conversation, tell me your source first. You know, I can't talk about this piece of information that you read on WeChat, posted by a neighbor who reposted from another person who heard it from another person. So to me, yes, there's that kind of hierarchy almost of elitism, if it's a professional journalist, because they are doing the hard work. Even back in China, they are themselves going inside the hospitals to collect firsthand, you know, evidence to educate us. In the US, journalists are constantly talking about how standards are constantly being raised. In the past, you could just use 2 sources or 4 sources and say, I did my research and talk to the experts. Now, say New York Times or Washington Post, they're definitely saying that in the newsroom, they need to provide 10 sources on the record and 20 sources off the record. We need to give them the respect and the credit. So given that we had a slightly late start, we're stretching this event a few minutes past the end time, but I very much realized that there's so many great comments and so many great questions in the comment area. So maybe our university will host another events down the line, because this virus does not appear to be going away. And even if this one goes away, there could be another crisis down the road. Our elections are very much underway. This is definitely not a new event. Some people said, fake news has always existed, but what is different in 2020 than 2016? So if Dr. Drucker or Professor Chun has any last minute comments?
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. Like Dr. Wu was saying, it's this needs like a full day workshop. I will share my my slides. It wasn't really slides, but I'll share my notes as well, so that when you get the link to the video, you'll also have that as well. And I'll also put some hyperlinks to some of the articles and resources that I mentioned.
And I want to finish up by saying I'll also make the slides available, and hopefully there'll be some useful links and resources there. There's a tremendous frustration because I'm looking at the questions in chat, and they are fabulous, and I would love to continue the conversation. But I think that the sign of any good session is that you come away with maybe more questions than you had when you entered the session. And I know that I'm coming away with additional questions that I had, and probably additional work. So Russell, maybe volume 2. So there's a lot there.
Yes.
There.
Well,
and to me, the most
thank
important
you
part.
all.
Go ahead. Our organizer did say if anybody wants to stick around, we'll chat for another 5 minutes or so, because there are some good questions. But if others want to sign off and go on with your day, please feel free to. Thank you so much for your support and great questions. I just wanted to echo Dr. Drucker and Professor Chun in saying the most rewarding part for me to give these conference presentations, panel speeches, is the after conversation, is the dialogue that we get to have from those questions. I don't know if anybody on my panel, I know Brian McFadden, also from Media Studies, actually raised this question about the role played by internet celebrities, because we have really entered the age where we're not just dealing with, the news media, like the biggest opinion leaders or influencers, most generally speaking, but these different levels of opinion leaders. Professor Chun, Dr. Drucker.
Well, I think the importance of celebrity can't be ignored, and whether it's influencers or it's the fact that the celebrities that we turn to in the more traditional notion of celebrity, not just the social media celebrities, that they are involved in this kind of misinformation ecosystem as well. So what you may find is that a celebrity that has 1 million followers innocently shares, reposts misinformation, and that then takes on a further distributional life of its own, and it gets more powerful because it has that kind of seal of approval that is given when a celebrity gives an endorsement of information. So I think we're dealing with the power of celebrity, not only in terms of social media celebrities, but traditional celebrities that have taken to social media that promulgate this as well in all sorts of new ways.
And Professor Chun, through his example, actually spoke to this very phenomenon, and I think it tied into the question that Joe Roslin asked about the direction that social media companies are taking or might take to limit fake news, because essentially these are the platforms that allow these new figures of public influence, these mini celebrities, to have an audience, to reach corners of, and to be, again, to emphasize the same note, these are not the mainstream sentiments. Like research continues to reinforce that the majority of Americans are very much on the same page. But by the news media reporting about these counter lockdown protests or early reopenings, governors going, on their own courses, they're all part of this kind of minority phenomenon that is competing for attention, competing for legitimacy. So this is actually the time for us to hold the social media companies more accountable. Facebook, Twitter, they continue to emphasize that they are free services. You can join and use their services for free. Therefore, they're not in the business of regulating speech. But this is 2020. This is after the 2016 elections, where it was confirmed that social media played a role in amplifying these conspiracy theories and allowing misinformation, disinformation campaigns to happen on these platforms. So I definitely have noticed that the news media, public figures, intellectuals, and those of us average citizens are taking measures and at least having conversations like these in which we say, it's not okay only because your service is free. Somehow you can just allow. So they're now, I guess, somewhat stepping up their efforts, but it's so sporadic and just unreliable.
Actually, I think, Russell, you were talking about this just the other day. There have been, I think, stepped up efforts. These businesses are not subject to First Amendment constraints. They are not required to do this. There have been some circumstances where the platforms themselves were stepping up the monitoring of this kind of information as a result of governmental pressure. So in an effort to stave off governmental involvement, they reverted to the very traditional mode of government, stay out of it. We can police ourselves. Look how active we are. So sometimes it's a technique to try to maintain a degree of autonomy and avoid government regulation to at least look like they're taking steps to deal with the problem. There are examples, for instance, in Germany. Germany passed a law in 2018, went into effect in January 2019, that would hold platforms that were on notice liable for large sums of money, millions of euros, if they were given notice that there was either hate speech or fake news. Actually, there was some reinterpretation that the German law did not include fake news, but at first it got a lot of coverage for including fake news. But the idea was that Germany passed a law where the onus was legally placed on platforms. They were given 48 hours to take down any information once they were given notice or face government fines. So sometimes that these actions that the platforms are taking themselves are actually in reaction to either threatened government measures or government measures that are taken. But I do think the bottom line is that they have in recent months certainly made an effort to become more active, but with what effect, I think the jury's out. So for example, most recently, Facebook announced a new initiative where essentially what they're really trying to do is employ more monitors, and then you're talking about human error, more monitors who will then, if not take down information, try to provide alternative sources for corroborated or valid sources. So they might divert information. They might provide a link to a WHO site that includes a myth builders page, or something along those lines. How effective those measures are and what the real motivation for those measures are, I think, as I said, I think the jury's still out.
And I think, you know, Judy Paris in the chat hit it on the nose. You know, that all comes down to economics and to PR, really. So we're seeing a lot of businesses, you know, this isn't COVID related, but, you know, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, private companies are saying, hey, we better take a stance on this. And because it's going to affect their, you know, revenue and their PR.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to comment on that great note. You know, in the American system, this is the ultimate, right? The marketplace will speak. And I think if there's any takeaway from me today, I guess this is just not the time for us to rely on one source to just say government step up or, you know, advertisers pull out. It is us, the citizens, at the root of it all. You know, from the Black Lives Matter protests to many other public events. A lot of these corporate entities feel the need to release a PR announcement or pull their advertisements because the citizens spoke in the first place. So I guess we're not giving you like very specific actionable items. There are just so many resources and so much research that continues to come out. But I think the most meaningful aspect to today's event is that we're having these conversations where we put our minds together and realize these ongoing issues that have been happening, but it is during specific episodes of public crisis where we realize that we need to do something. So there's that saying, let's not waste a crisis, let's do something and make the world better. So on that more positive note, I want to thank you all again for attending, and we'll be back in touch with the recording, the resources, and maybe another event as some of you have called for it. So have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much.